Financial markets in turmoil.
What are the root causes of the financial crisis?
The dollar losing value.
Heading for its biggest loss in nearly 3 decades.
Will Social Security even be there?
I don't know.
Buy or rent?
That's a very good question.
Interest rates.
I'm not so sure.
Where do you put your money?
I don't know.
Welcome to the show that answers your questions. This is Follow the Money Weekly with your host, economist, and best-selling author. Here's Jerry Robinson.
All right, friends, welcome to you all around the world. Welcome to Follow the Money Radio. So grateful to have you here along for the ride. We have a good show lined up for you today. Today, episode number 433. It's entitled Money, Power, and Taxes. Money, Power, and Taxes. And today we're going to be joined by an author from the UK. He was born in London and educated at the University of Manchester. He's a financial writer. He's written several books. His name is Dominic Frisby, and one of his latest books is entitled Daylight Robbery: How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. It's a very interesting read. And so today, the entire podcast is really just going to be an interview with Dominic talking about his book. And one of the things that I find very interesting about Dominic's book, which, by the way, was recommended to me by one of our very long-time members here at Follow the Money, is the fact that he goes back and he examines the history of taxation. You know, that's one of the very interesting aspects of any topic. One of the things that I liked about economics when I studied economics was not just all of the math that was involved. I mean, that obviously, you know, is interesting at some level. But to me, I was very interested in the economics, or the history of economics, I should say. And this is what Dominic has done, is he's really done a nice survey on the history of taxation. And I know taxes may not be the most exciting topic out there, trust me. I mean, there's many more things that may be more important in your mind. But quite frankly, taxes, as Dominic shows in this book, are more important than any of us may think. And by the way, we're just 1 month away now from tax day, April 15th. So it's coming up right away. So a little bit of fitting topic here for today's broadcast. So I want to bring on Dominic here in just a minute, but let's just lay the groundwork here. You know, let's start with the basics. You know, taxation is how governments collect money from individuals, right? And it's evolved over time. It used to be that the government would request that you pay the money. Today, we live in a time where the government literally just puts their hand into your paycheck and pulls out the money through the income tax that was introduced back in 1913, the same year, by the way, that the Federal Reserve was introduced. Those two kind of go hand in hand. But, you know, taxes are how the government pays for things like roads, schools, hospitals, other public goods and services. And without taxes, these things, you know, could be possible if privatization, you know, made a way. But in reality, our society would be a pretty chaotic place if we didn't have governments and their taxing powers. Now, there's a lot of debate about that, and there's a lot of people who say we just need to get rid of the tax code, and I am all about, you know, reforming taxes, absolutely. But as Dominic makes pretty clear in his book, the world has evolved, and so has taxation over time. You know, when we go back, we look at different human societies, even in ancient times. We had tribute payments made by subject states to dominant powers. We had temple taxation in ancient Greece and Rome. There were feudal taxes during the Middle Ages. I mean, taxes have taken on many different forms throughout history, and you don't always pay with, you know, paper money the way we do today. You know, throughout history, people have paid with grain or with some form of commodity or their produce. They would pay with other types of gold or silver. So different types of things have been used to pay for taxes. And when we look at how the world has evolved, the rise of nation states in our, you know, modernity, we have centralized taxation. That became the norm. And the Industrial Revolution and the growth of social welfare programs in the 20th century, you know, taxes took on this really great role in society, where governments began to collect taxes directly from their citizens in the form of income taxes and sales taxes and property taxes. And the governments began to kind of morph into, into very larger governments than ever before. and created bureaucracies to manage the collection and distribution of taxes. And as these countries grew more, powerful and their taxation powers grew, well, they began to take on more and more responsibility for the welfare of their citizens. So now we have taxes that are used to fund social programs like education, healthcare, and Social Security in a way that was just not even envisioned, say a millennia ago. Of course, taxes are not popular. I mean, they're never popular. And there are several instances in Dominic's book where he talks about tax revolts. We'll talk about that a little bit in the interview, as I'm just kind of laying that out as we prepare for him to come on. But, tax revolts like the Boston Tea Party, you may recall in history class in the United States, the Peasants' War in Germany. But even though there were tax revolts, modern taxation just continued to grow, continued to evolve, and has become an essential part of, the form of modern governance. And, today we're living in a time where people are wondering, how we should go forward when it comes to taxes. And not everybody, as I mentioned, is happy with the way that taxes are being used. There's obviously many instances of tax evasion, tax avoidance, people and corporations trying to reduce their tax burden, people complaining about tax loopholes given to the rich, people worried about tax benefits being given to the poor, and so there's a lot around this topic, and it evokes a lot of emotion. And it's obviously a hotly debated issue. But what I want to do is I want to bring on our guest today, Dominic Frisby, and let him share some of the fascinating research that he did in writing his book, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. Let's head into that interview right now. Friends, welcome back to Follow the Money Radio. Great to have you here. Today, we are joined by a very special guest by the name of Dominic Frisby. He is a financial writer, author of several books, including the one we'll be talking about today, Daylight Robbery, How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. In addition to being a writer, he is also a stand-up comedian, which I find to be very interesting, as well as a voiceover artist. It's great to have you here on Follow the Money Radio, Dominic. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And comedy and finance is an odd combination, but somehow it works.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. We'll either laugh or you cry with some of the economics we have to deal with today. So tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into your book, because I do want to discuss Daylight Robbery and talk about taxes and some of the research that you put into that book. But tell us a little bit about how you got interested in economics and how that crosses with stand-up comedy. How does that all work?
Well, it's all a bit accidental, but I started out my life doing voiceovers back in the day. I went to drama school and trained to be an actor, but for some reason I just got loads of voiceover work, much more than I did acting work. And then a few years in, I wrote this comedy song, and I said to a friend of mine who was a music agent, "Oh, can I get this released as a comedy single?" And he said, "No, but you can go and do it in my brother's comedy club." So I went and did that, and they had a thing called an open spot. And if it went well, you got a paid booking. And it went very well, and I got a paid booking, and they got me lots of other paid bookings. And suddenly I was a stand-up comic. And this is back in the late 1990s. So it was all, even that was a bit accidental. But by the mid-2000s, I'd made a bit of money. And also my dad had made a bit of money. And we were trying to turn that bit of money into a lot of money, because there was this thing we were trying to raise money for, this musical called Kisses on a Postcard, which we were trying to bring into the West End. And so I started reading on the internet, and it seemed like gold and commodities were the place to be. We're talking about 2005 now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and there were lots of these clever people talking on the internet. I remember watching interviews with Jim Rogers and James Turk and people like that, and James Dines, and thinking I'd really love to be able to talk to these people. But, I imagine they all charge $500 an hour or something for their time. How can I talk to them without having to pay them? And so because I had a background in audio, I started a podcast. And the very first person I interviewed was Jim Rogers. And this was back in 2006. And and it was, it was quite popular. It was at one point, it was the most popular investment podcast in the UK. But one of the people I interviewed was this woman called Merrin Somerset Webb, who was a FT journalist, and she ran a magazine called Money Week. And she said, "Oh, we need people like you to come and write for us." And I said, "Well, I don't know anything." And she said, "Oh, that doesn't matter." And I went to meet the MD, and they started me writing this weekly column. And here I am 17 or 18 years later, and I still write it. And I think the reason my column was successful is because comedy, if people don't understand what you're saying, they don't laugh. And so that sort of dynamic forces the discipline of clarity onto the comedian. And so I always made sure that whatever I wrote was clear, but also I knew it had to be entertaining if you're to keep the reader's attention right to the end of the article. Whereas a lot of financial journalists are just very boring, and often you don't understand what they're talking about. And I struggle to get beyond a paragraph. And in fact, obfuscation is rife throughout finance. Alan Greenspan used to talk about purposeful obfuscation.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, his talks were quite comic in how obfuscatory they were. But anyway, so that happened. And then over the course of the late noughties, I became, one of the reasons I sort of embraced it with such a passion is that, in investing in gold, you very quickly learn about fiat money and how fiat money systems work and all the rest of it. And I could never understand why it was that house prices in England were so expensive and why they were so divorced from what people actually earn. And it was only when you learned about fiat money and so on that you began to understand that. And so I became convinced gradually over time that if we're to save the world, then we need to fix our system of money. And so I wrote this film that was very popular. I didn't get properly credited for it, but anyway, I wrote it and narrated it, called Four Horsemen. And that got millions and millions of views. Well, I wrote and narrated that, or co-wrote and narrated.
Is that right? Huh.
And ironically, the bloke who made it never paid anyone else who was involved and ran off with all the money. So it was a film all about economic reform, but there you go. Anyway, but that sort of gave me the confidence that I could write about big subjects. So my first book was a book called Life After the State, which was basically arguing for limited government. And if we're going to save the world, then we need to fix our money system. And this was written in 2012. And as I was writing it, I found out about Bitcoin. So I thought, oh yeah, this might be and I think if you read Life After the State, it's got the first paragraph from a book by a recognized publisher about Bitcoin in it. Basically saying maybe this is the answer. And then as I was writing it, Bitcoin just took off. So my next book was published in 2013. It was called Bitcoin, the Future of Money. And it was the first book on Bitcoin from a recognized publisher. But unfortunately, I published it in that first crypto winter. Do you remember when Bitcoin went to like $1,200 and then collapsed?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So it never got published in North America. So nobody in North America knows about it. But it was, it was quite a big deal here in the UK. And so that was my next book. And then over time, I sort of slightly morphed from fix money, fix the world to fix money and tax, fix the world. And I sort of think money and tax, they sort of are the same thing, because obviously inflation, fiat money is a tax in itself, as I'm sure you and all your listeners, readers know. But you design a society the way you tax it. And you determine the destiny of that society by the way you tax it, whether it's people are going to be prosperous or poor, or whether they're going to be free or subordinated. And I just became more and more obsessed with tax. And then I started to look back through history, and I realized that there is not one great event in all of human history behind which there is not a tax story. And if you delve around, you always find that tax story. And if there wasn't that tax story, that event would have unfolded very differently. And to give you an example of what I mean, every single war in history was paid for by some kind of tax, usually tax and debt. And debt is obviously a tax on the future. And then, and then after the war, so that's war. Every single conquest in history was motivated by taxation. You take control of the profits, the land, the produce, the plunder, all of that. So every single conquest, every single war, and even great religions were basically ruling systems of control, which tax plays a key part. And if you look at, the birth of Christ, the reason that Jesus was in Bethlehem at that time was because Mary and Joseph were there to pay a tax. They were there for a census. You look at Islam and the birth of Islam, there was a tax story at the heart of Islam. And you can go through the only, and every revolution was a rising up against some kind of injustice perpetrated by the tax system, the American Revolution being the most famous. And then even natural disasters, there's a tax story at the heart of them as well, because usually there's some kind of tax involved in the rebuilding effort afterwards. So I just became convinced that once you look at the world through this prism of money and tax, then everything looks completely different. And so that's me, and that's how I came to be where I am, and that's why I wrote that book. And I hope that's rather a lengthy introduction, but that's me.
Well, I appreciate it. It's very interesting. And taxes, those are a very dry topic. So I was a bit surprised whenever I saw the book, and the book was actually recommended to us by one of our longtime members who actually met you, I believe, at a conference over in the UK. And he suggested the book. I checked out the book. I really enjoyed it. And again, it's a dry topic when you think about it. But as you pointed out, the history here is actually quite fascinating. And so you've kind of answered why you tackled taxes, because they really do incentivize or de-incentivize, human progress, I guess we could call it that. You undoubtedly learned a lot of interesting things. You bring up the fact that taxes are a key motivator behind so much of history. And, we all know that money and incentives for money are obviously guiding history, and we can see that. But taxes, it's a topic that I would say many people wouldn't think about, but you do a great job of digging into the history and showing how so many different historical events, if not, as you point out, practically all of them, have a tax story.
I would say that taxation has shaped the course of human history. And taxation in itself should be a subject that is taught along with physics and chemistry and mathematics and biology and languages. It's that big and it's that important. At the moment, it's like a tiny subset of economics, and not everyone studies economics, but it's huge and it's fascinating. And I would go further and say, like, a common trope that you have in a film, particularly zombie films, is that if we're going to save the world, then we have to find the zero patient zero. And that's the originator. That's your Wuhan lab. That's where the virus first originated. And you have to get to the virus and either kill the zero patient, or somehow the zero patient will have the antidote by which you eliminate the virus. And I would say, if we are to save the West, to save the world, if we only focused on reforming our system of taxation, of lowering it and simplifying it, then everything else falls into place quite naturally. And when I say, tax is patient zero, and it's that big and that important a subject. And if you look at history, the most inventive societies, the most innovative societies, the most brilliant societies have always been low tax societies. Taxation is a measure of freedom. The less you're taxed, the more of your own labor you own. And if you look at the most backward, repressive, horrible, tyrannical societies, they've all been high tax societies. And so, there is a correlation between the two.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how times have evolved, or how taxes have evolved, I should say, throughout time. Because today, when we think about the United States or even the UK, these are countries that when you go back in time, and I want you to speak to this, but when you go back in time, say here in the United States, let's use that as the example, the colonists were paying relatively little tax relative to where we are today. And in fact, the enforceability of that tax was also seemed to be quite minimal compared to the enforceability that tax collectors enjoy today. So they certainly didn't have the ability to reach into your pocket through the income tax and actually take it out of your paycheck. So, and we know that during the American Revolution, there was a lot of rich, and poor not paying taxes. They were able to kind of get around it through all manner of means. So when we look back, we say, well, today in the United States, when you think about all of the various taxes, it's almost as if the revolution of America, the American Revolution, failed if their goal was to have fair taxation, because in the United States, the tax rates, when you think about it, and I'd like to have you speak to that, they seem absurdly high when you add in the state tax, local tax, federal tax, and all of the different excise taxes. It almost seems like a bad joke that the country was started to have fair taxation.
And you forgot the inflation tax.
Oh, sure. Oh, no. You're so true. So true.
Well, I think if the founding fathers saw what had happened, they would be pretty hacked off, because what America has become was not the America that it was originally designed to be. And there's two major betrayals. One is income tax and the other is gold and silver. There's money. But the income tax wasn't as inevitable. It's kind of funny. Fiat money enabled income tax in a funny kind of way. Mm-hmm. And the reason income tax has been so successful is around the world now, something like 50% of government revenue worldwide comes from income tax. It's just an extraordinarily successful tax from the point of view of the person collecting it. And the reason for that is that it's an easy tax to collect, because you make the company that employs the worker responsible for collecting the tax. And if the company doesn't do that properly, the company gets into a load of trouble. So the company collects the tax and he deducts that tax at source. So the worker in most cases has never actually received the money. And that's why it's an easy tax to collect. It's an efficient tax. Now that will change slightly as more and more people join the gig economy and freelance and so on. And that's a sort of longer term problem that governments have got on their hands, because they are raising their levels of spending generally without concomitantly raising their taxation revenues. But going back to the original question of income tax in America, it was actually Abraham Lincoln that introduced it in, I'm going to say 1862, I think was the year, but forgive me if I get that year wrong. And he introduced it to America in order to raise money that he needed to pay for the war, the Civil War. And in fact, that law that requires Americans to pay tax to America wherever they are in the world if they want to retain their American citizenship, that is another thing that Lincoln brought in to protect revenues to pay for that war. And in fact, I argue in that book that war was essentially about protecting Union tax revenues. Mm-hmm. I make the case that we're taught today that it was about slavery. Well, the Emancipation Act came several years later, and Lincoln said he had no plans to impose anti-slavery laws on the South when he was elected, and the South still wanted to secede. And so I maintain that war, I mean, it was everyone fighting over their economic interests is the bottom line, but it was the role of tax in the lead up to that war plays a much bigger role than what we are currently taught today. Mm-hmm. But moving forward, income tax was abandoned after the Civil War. I think it was abandoned in the 1870s, maybe. But America's constant problem was that revenue at the federal level could only be obtained by export and import tariffs. They've found it very hard to tax workers. And because export and import tariffs had played such a big role, the South paying the majority of taxes, at one stage nearly 90% of federal revenue came from the southern states. No wonder and it was mostly spent on propping up northern industry. Mm-hmm. Because of that, America was constantly looking for ways by which it could replace that revenue. So it was constantly looking at income tax, and it fell in and out of it. And bizarrely, what made income tax eventually possible was I I think do you call it the temperance movement, when there was this move to make alcohol illegal?
Yep. Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so there was a big, like, they never, the guy, what's his name? Wheeler. It's so long since I've written the book, my memory's gone, but Wheeler was the guy behind the temperance movement, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
And one of the reasons he could never get his anti-alcohol laws over the line, he was a formidable campaigner, but one of the reasons he could never get them over the line is because alcohol duty played such a large role in government revenue. And unless he could find some substitute for the revenues that came from alcohol duties, he was never going to get his laws over the line. So he became a massive campaigner for income tax. And he is said to have invented pressure politics, where he could use his minority, his strong minority vote, to enable decisions. And so income tax came to America in 1913. And then, I'm sorry if I get my dates wrong, and then it got kind of reinforced by the First World War. But ordinary Americans still weren't paying it. It was only really affecting rich Americans. And it only really came to ordinary Americans with the Revenue Act of 1942. And by the way, I'll come back to that act in just a moment, but just on the principles of income tax, I don't like it generally. I recognize that it's an easy tax to collect, but if you're a young person starting out with nothing, all you have is your labor. And we taxed labor constantly and heavily. And in addition, you're paid in money that is also has its value eroded by the constant erosion that's inflation. So if it makes it very difficult for any young person starting out. The whole setup of the economy favors the asset rich against the asset poor. And we tax workers very heavily, and assets largely go untaxed. And that's, for me, is the cause of the huge inequality gap that we have between generations. But in any case, in 1942, income tax came to every man with the Revenue Act of 1942. And there was a huge campaign to persuade Americans that this was a good thing. There was Donald Duck was used in campaigns. Irving Berlin composed a song, "I paid my income tax today, 1,000 planes to bomb Berlin. They've got to be paid for, and I chipped in." Now, was ever the link between war and tax made more stark than in that song? But Americans were persuaded there was a national need, yada, 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 and income tax became a thing. The crisis passed, World War II went away, but the tax remained. And that is always the case. You need some kind of crisis to impose a new tax, but once the crisis has gone away, taxes never go back to the levels they were before the crisis began. And this has been a pattern throughout history. And it's the nature of democratic government, it seems, that they just gradually get more and more bloated. So at the moment, America, I said the founding fathers would be rather disappointed by what they saw in North America. But in North America, you actually pay less tax than we do in Western Europe. In Western Europe, taxation as a percentage of GDP. In France, it's well over 50%, especially if you include inflation. And in the UK, we're sort of, if you include inflation, we're at 50%. In the States, you're more like at about 40%. But the life of the medieval serf, which was effectively the descendant of the Roman slave in Western Europe, was that he had to give half his working life to till the soil of his lord, and the other half of his working week he was able to till his own soil. So effectively, his labor was 50% owned. And that's the same as today. Your labor is 50% owned. Obviously, we're much freer than the medieval serf is because we have technology, and technology is in itself liberating, so we can drive anywhere and fly anywhere and so on. But that same dynamic of half your labor is owned still applies.
It's so interesting. And you brought up so many topics there that I want to dive into. But let's begin with that medieval serf, because it makes me think, you write about in the book even about the Black Death. and the incredible impact, of course, we all know that this had upon the West, the decoupling from the church. But I wonder how the devastation of Europe, where you have so many people dying around the Black Death, how does this change the idea of tax? How was the taxation approach altered from the Black Death? What's the takeaway there?
Well, it created an incredible dynamic. So in medieval Europe, secularism came a bit later, really. Medieval Europe was still pretty Catholic in those days. We had what's called the feudal system. And, each person was answerable to the next person up in the feudal system. So the serf, and then you had the lord of the manor, and then the knights, and right up to the barons, and right up to the kings, and so on. And each person was paying some kind of tithe to the next person up the ladder. And in the case of the serf, well, they were just property, they were owned, and they came with the land. And, these people weren't handling money or anything. There just wasn't enough cash to go around. And they, if the land was taken over by another knight or another lord, well, the serfs came with them. They didn't have their own freedom. They couldn't travel anywhere else. They were just tied to the land, and they could till the lord's land half the week, and their own land, it wasn't their land, but the produce of that land was theirs to keep. But what happened with the Black Death? So the wealth of the Western Europe was land. That was where the wealth was. But what happened with the Black Death is it wiped out something like 2/3 of the European population. And so suddenly there was a massive labor shortage. And there wasn't a land shortage. There was a shortage of people able to till the land. And so this empowered the serfs in a funny kind of way. And it was the beginning of the end of the feudal system. And serfs were able to effectively go, well, if you want me to carry on tilling your land, you've got to pay me. Or I'm going to go and till this other guy's land because he's offering me money and you're not offering me anything. And so with this shortage of labor, serfs were effectively able to buy their own freedom. And in many cases, they were handling money for the very first time. So on the one hand, it wiped out 2/3 of the population. But on the other hand, it empowered those at the very bottom. And it was the beginning of the end of the feudal system.
Right. And now let's go back to America for a minute, because in America, you had mentioned at the Revolution, and of course, even in the Civil War, that oftentimes taxes were imposed to pay for wars, to fund the violence. But in the case of the American Revolution, here you have a war that is inspired against taxes. I guess the question becomes here is...
It was still paid for with taxes, though.
And of course, it was paid, right. It was still paid for with taxes. But in your research, is this... And
by the way, debt, I count debt as a form of tax. It's a tax on the future.
Inflation and debt. Yeah, these are both taxes. Yeah. But now when we think about America and the formation of it, how unique is the violent reaction that the colonists have to the taxes? Is this something that we see throughout time? Obviously, war is connected to taxes, how you fund war. But this violent reaction on the part of the American revolutionaries, the violence that is the reaction to this taxation without representation. Of course, many people throughout time had taxation without representation. But did we see this kind of successful violent uprising that we see in the American Revolution? Is this a novel thing in history? Is it new to see this, or is this a commonplace event that we see throughout history?
I think in terms of the empire, the people that came from Western Europe, especially Britain and Ireland, to populate the United States, what became the United States, saw themselves as British citizens. And that was where everybody went. It was the land of opportunity. We didn't really populate, say Africa or, India or other parts of the empire in the same way. We did Australia, but not other parts. People went there, but there wasn't this massive exodus of people to those places. We went there, we conquered them, we controlled them, we taxed them, we plundered them, we did all those things that the empire did, but it wasn't the same dynamic as this new country of opportunity that North America was. Yet North America was treated by the British political establishment as another colony. And they didn't actually impose taxes that were that high. It was just that the taxes were really finicky and really invasive, and they got under people's skin. Tea and cards and all these stupid things, that stamps, all these ways that it was just like, almost like excessive parking charges or something. They just really irked everyone. Mm-hmm. And the people who fought against the British overlords, they thought they were fighting for rights that were enshrined by their nationality, by their birthright. They thought that they were just merely fighting for the rights that already existed, that were enshrined in Magna Carta, which was in itself the result, that document, the great document of freedom, was the result of another tax war between King John and the barons. Sure. So they didn't think they were fighting for new rights or new freedoms. They thought they were fighting for freedoms that were theirs by right. So we weren't conquering the people who settled in North America in the same way that we were, say, conquering bits of West Africa or India or something like that. So that was the fundamental difference in dynamic. And you have to say that the British political establishment ballsed it up. They didn't recognize the difference. And, as I say, injudicious taxes are behind pretty much every revolt in history, and this was no different.
All right, you're listening to the voice of Dominic Frisby, and he is the author of Daylight Robbery, and we're very happy to have him here on the program. Dominic, you were mentioning earlier about your fascination with Bitcoin, how you discovered Bitcoin and even wrote a book on it early back in 2012. And we see that Bitcoin does offer, has a promise of monetary sovereignty. And I know that you talk about this in your book. I know that you talk about some of the ways we can fix the problems that we have today with the tax. I mean, you and I could sit here and talk about the problems of the tax system, the current tax system for eons. But one of the things that I like about your book is that you propose solutions. And so I'd like to move into that. But you bring up Bitcoin, and let's talk about Bitcoin in the context of a solution to the egregious taxes, inflation, debt, and of course, proper taxes proper. How does Bitcoin fix that, in your opinion? And how can it be part of the solution?
When you have one body in a society that is able to create money at no cost to itself, it is inevitable that society will become imbalanced, and that the body that has the power to create money at no cost to itself will grow disproportionately large. And that is the essential problem at the heart of the fiat economy. And the solution to this is independent money. Then the rules are the same for the powers that be as they are for the ordinary citizen. If nobody in a society has power to create money, but all must earn it equally, then society will inevitably be more equal. And the problem with gold, I love gold. I love everything it stands for. But money is and gold is the money of last resort. But what people fail to realize is that promises are traded far more readily than gold, and they always have been. And so I'll give you a nice story that describes this and illustrates the point. Promises go all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia. The first written documents were basically written promises relating to debts owed. And so the money has evolved as technology has evolved, especially communications technology. Now, when the first telegraphic lines were laid across the Atlantic between Britain and Ireland, as it was then, and North America, and they started sending in messages to each other across the Atlantic, within 2 weeks of those first cables being successfully laid, two parties, one in London and one in America, sent across the first official exchange rate between the pound and the dollar. And the great expression of the time is it took 2 weeks to send a boat to go across the Atlantic. And so the great expression was 2 weeks to 2 hours, because that was how efficient suddenly when we were able to communicate through this cable. And that first official exchange rate was agreed between two parties who trusted each other. And so from that point on, could people begin sending money across the Atlantic. And that's why the pound-dollar exchange rate was called cable. Now, they weren't sending, both countries were on a gold standard. They weren't sending gold down the cable. They were sending promises between two parties who trusted each other. And now, you know, we've got these incredible computer networks all around the world sending money to each other. And, you know, the banking system and SWIFT, and within our own countries, you know, I can send money to, you know, my son who's 3 hours down the road at university instantaneously. But it's all just promises that are changing hands. It's not actual money. So money evolves as communication technology evolves. Now, at the moment, if you think of what is called the Shanghai Cooperation Association, which is all the countries in Asia, basically, and starting with China to the east, Russia to the north, India to the south, and say Iran to the east. So you've got all those countries, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Pakistan and Afghanistan, and actually maybe not Afghanistan. And I think Turkey's applied to join. And we're talking about 40% of the world's landmass. And they're all still using the US dollar to settle payments, even though none of them particularly like the US dollar and none of them particularly like America. And in many cases, they're the American enemies of America. But they know that to an extent, they can trust the America and the white man's payment system and the US dollar and the US dollar banking system more than they can trust each other. Because a lot of those countries are, you know, run by not particularly sympathetic regimes, shall we say. And so the US dollar has maintained its position as the global reserve currency because of the fact that it's just the best in a bad bunch. And it's that much more trustworthy than anything else. Now, obviously, America demonstrated with quite dramatic effect how it's prepared to use its financial power as a weapon of war, as did Western Europe when they froze Russia out of the banking system, when it invaded Ukraine, and they confiscated whatever it was, $350 billion worth of Russian assets. And you can be sure that every other country in that Shanghai Cooperation organization is going to be looking at that going, wow, we need to de-dollarize because otherwise we're in a bit of trouble. Because, and you know, China's got, what is it, $3 trillion or something ridiculous? I think it's got more dollars than America does. And China's going to be thinking, well, we can't just have America freezing the profits of 30 years of trade or whatever it is, just like that. But then at the same time, they're not going to go, we're abandoning the dollar, because they're just too invested in it or caught up in it. Now, okay, so there's all sorts of proposals being made as to what these nations actually use. And some are saying, well, they're going to use a digital gold-backed yuan and they're going to find some gold-backed currency. They've still got the essential problem. They can't send gold down a computer, down a computer cable. And all of those countries, they don't quite trust each other. So let's say, you know, India wants to buy X amount of natural gas from Russia, and Russia's like, fine, yeah, but we want you to pay us in whatever, gold. Well, how's India going to get that gold to Russia? Is it going to fly over? What if somebody shoots the plane down? What if somebody besieges the armored convoy or whatever it is? It's just problematic. And if only there was a trustless system of money that didn't require third parties to trust each other, that could resolve in immediate settlement, and that couldn't be debased by any member of those parties, if only such a thing existed. Well, it does exist, and the solution to the problem of the Shanghai Cooperation Association is right there in front of it. And the irony is that it's the most, in often cases with Bitcoin, it's the least likable regimes that are the ones that adopt it first, because they're the ones that have debased its money by the most. But so, I'm not saying those countries are going to do it, but there is a solution right in front of their noses waiting to happen. And so that's one huge potential role that Bitcoin could have in the future. But it's a technologically brilliant, it's a huge technological breakthrough, new system of money, independent system of money. And I just think everyone should have an allocation to it in their portfolio, because its potential is so huge. It won't necessarily achieve its potential. And I think in a funny case, the more successful it is, the more likely somebody's going to try and make it illegal. And it's all very well saying they can't make it illegal, but if North America suddenly decided to ban Bitcoin, it's a major problem. But if they also decide they're going to ban Bitcoin, then things have got very bad. But yeah, I just think everyone should own some Bitcoin, because effectively, by owning some Bitcoin, you are investing in this new technology that has such enormous potential.
Yeah, and it really is quite something. When you think about the research, when I look at your book and I see the research that you've done through time of the different tax regimes throughout history, obviously people didn't pay these taxes always in US dollars, of course. Whatever the common currency was at the time, that's what they would often
pay the tax. You would often pay the tax in your labor.
In your labor, exactly, right. So there would be various ways of paying this: labor or some other manner of currency,
or a share of your produce,
which we even see perhaps like in the Jewish laws that you were talking about, where so now, but when we think about where we are today, here we are alive, where we see this invention of money, a new form of value exchange in the form of Bitcoin. And as you pointed out, you think people should own it, but I think it's pretty interesting to see that you've done this research on global taxation, the history of it. And then we are now in this time where we have this advent of a new form of value exchange in the form of Bitcoin. Although you're bullish on it, how likely do you think it is to survive based upon what you have learned about the way regimes have reacted to things like this in the past? And let me just add something to that question is that I'm of the opinion, as a longtime bull of Bitcoin, a longtime Bitcoin bull, that, as you pointed out, the government could certainly try to outlaw it, say the United States. It would be difficult for them to enforce that. You would only create people who would be operating in the shadows, of course, but that would be very devastating to the emergence of it as a solution. How likely do you think that is? How desperate do you think the United States is to maintain its monopoly on the global reserve currency? Because Bitcoin certainly, unless they have a better plan than what I've seen so far, they don't seem to have a solution on preventing Bitcoin from competing with the US dollar long term. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think as an Englishman, I often, I see things that are going on in my country and I just despair at the state of things. And I look at, what a great nation we were in Victorian times and so on, and our marvelous contributions and so on. And you just develop a very low opinion of yourself, of your country. And then you go abroad and you see how your country is perceived abroad, and you actually think, oh, it's not quite as bad as I thought it was. And I listen to a lot of American media, and particularly libertarian themed stuff, because that appeals to me. I think if I was to sum up the world's problems, I would say we need lower taxes and greater individual responsibility, independent money, fiat money is the root of most of our problems, and less government, something like that. Anyway, but I listen to Americans moaning about the US dollar and what's going on in America and so on. And I often think you forget how highly and how well perceived you are from outside the United States. And if people said to me, you can go and live anywhere in the world, I can go and live anywhere in the world pretty much, but I'm sort of tied here because of family and all the rest of it. But, if I could go and live anywhere in the world, there are lots of places in the United States that would be close to the top of my list. It is still, a fantastic country and so on. And I think it's in a bad place, but it's not as bad. It's the best of a bad bunch. I think you've got major problems in the United States. I think the interracial tension is a huge problem. And I think the divide between...
It's been that way from the beginning, though, of course.
Well, maybe it's just the videos that are appearing on my Twitter and stuff,
sure,
with more frequency, but it seems to be really bad. And,
it is.
Lots and lots of violent attacks, and every day they seem to be another one of somebody. Anyway, I don't like to talk about it because it upsets me seeing it. But, that is you've got a lot of division across racial and cultural lines. You've got a lot of division along, and so do we, by the way, in Western Europe. Slightly different, but with a lot of crossover. But there's also, the state has replaced religion. People need something to believe in, and they've stopped believing in God, and they're starting to believe in the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. And so you've got this sort of religious war going on between left and right, which we have in Western Europe as well, by the way. It's no better. But that is a major problem. I also think you've got this industrial military complex that is just so powerful and so influential. And I don't think I like the ethical. I don't think I like that. I don't like what it's become. I reckon, you are the world's policeman, and so you do have an important role to play, but, a lot of your foreign intervention has been misguided.
Of course.
And so that's another problem. And you could take a really absolutist line in it and go, nothing that happens beyond our borders is our problem. And, I get that absolutist line, but the reality of politics is international politics is not that simple. But in any case, so that's another issue that you've got. And, your state is growing bigger and bigger all the time. And I just find so many of particularly Kamala Harris, when I watch little speeches she does, I just find her really mendacious. And so maybe that's a personal grudge, I don't know. But so the sum of all that is, I think you've got problems, but again, it's still a pretty good country, and there's a lot of opportunity there, and there's a lot of another problem you've got is in your food industry and health, but that's another thing. So, but you look at America, you go, okay, it's got this and this problem, but where is better? And there aren't that many places that are better. And so I'm not one of these, the US dollar's going to collapse guys. I think there will be a lot of other currencies that go down the Swanee first. I'm a sort of favor of, I think a more likely scenario is just this sort of continuous, relentless, gradual decline. And I think, the US dollar's lost, 90%, 95% of its purchasing power since 1971, and the pound's lost a lot more. There's no reason why I can't lose another 95% over the next 50 years and still be the primary means of payment within those countries.
I'm total agreement with you. In fact, we've taught that for a long time, that similar to the way that Britain lost its economic crown at the beginning of the 20th century to the United States, it wasn't, shock and awe. It was just this steady erosion that just slowly saw the fortunes change. And that's how I also feel, the way you've described it very well, is that the United States, we don't see the dollar falling off of the cliff. We don't see it just going away tomorrow, but it's going to be this slow and perhaps even humiliating decline, as you pointed out, as other nations are incentivized to move away from a dollar order, and it will happen slowly but surely.
I think war accelerates it. So, what ended Britain was the First World War. And then what really put the boot in was the Second World War. And then you look at what a great country America was. And then even just the Vietnam War sort of was a massive dent. So war doesn't help. Because in the old days, in the sort of whatever it was, 13th, 14th, 15th century, you go and invade another country, you conquer it, and then you plunder it, and then you tax it. But war doesn't work like that now. Like we beat Germany in World War II, but we weren't able, we couldn't go and plunder Germany and take all this money and everything. So that just changed the economic incentives of war. And so, war without those incentives is kind of pointless.
Right.
If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
But anyway, so, but the American industrial military complex and every other thing makes money out of war because it collects it in taxes. But it's not the taxes of the plundered nation or the conquered nation. It's the taxes of your nation. So it's just it's not a profitable business in the way that it once was maybe 200 years ago or something. And to call war a business is pretty grim, but I think you take my point.
It's true.
So,
it's true.
Yeah, you've got to stay out of overseas conflict, but and these things happen gradually and then suddenly. But I maintain that thing. Everyone's going, China's the next great empire. Well, it might be, but it's not that free. Well over 50% of everything in that country is state-owned and state-run. The state is inherently incompetent. It's got massive demographic problems coming its way with the one-child policy and so on. It's not that great, China. I know in the sense that it makes everything and processes everything and refines everything. So it's like, Venice was or something back in the day. And in that sense, its economic might is on the increase, but it's not. And in some ways it's innovative, but it strikes me that still a lot of the innovation still comes in the West, even if we outsource the manufacturing of the innovation out East. So, it's not that cut and dry, but I do often think, people often compare the fall of Rome to what's going on now. But I sort of see Britain as Rome and America as Byzantium. And, the Byzantines all saw themselves as Romans. And Byzantium didn't fall for maybe another 1,000 years after Rome was taken by the Goths. And so really, you talk about debasing the money, and whenever that happened in 300 or 400 AD with Diocletian and all the rest of it, well, but it just went east to Byzantium, and Rome may have fallen, but Constantinople didn't. And Constantinople was the new Rome. And so it can go on for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sure can. Now, we're in our closing moments here with our guest today. He is the author of Daylight Robbery: How Tax Shaped Our Past and Will Change Our Future. His name is Dominic Frisby. And as we bring this to a close, let's just bring a couple of points to the surface here. One is, and you've made some great points, and I wish we had more time to drill down deeper into some of the things that you've said, because you've made a lot of great points, especially for those who are listening. U.S. listeners, certainly in this audience, will certainly agree with you about the military-industrial complex. I mean, Dominic, we're paying on the order now of nearly $1 trillion for the Pentagon's annual budget, which cannot pass
1 trillion.
Nearly 1 trillion. Yeah, nearly.
On the military.
On the military. It's probably, I would say maybe 858. It's approaching $1 trillion, 858 billion. But you realize
so much money.
It's a
Do you even know how many amount of money? People forget how much. If I gave you $1 million every day, every single day since the day that Jesus was born, which we'll assume was the 25th of December in the year zero, and every single day since then, I gave you $1 million, I still would not have given you $1 trillion.
Right. It's absurd. It's absurd. And this is what's going in to fund the Pentagon, practically that amount per year. And that Pentagon, by the way, has never been able to successfully pass an audit. So you certainly have the military industrial complex, which is a disaster, and it's getting worse. And then you also have the health issues that you were talking about, and the way the government views, or the way the people view the government as a replacement of religion almost. In fact, you're so right that Republicans and Democrats here in the United States fight amongst themselves the way we might look back and see Protestants and Catholics fighting, in the past. It's very, very similar kinds of heresies, heretical kind of language that's used and arguments. So it is a very bizarre time. But one of the things that has been proposed here in the United States is to replace the income tax with a national sales tax as one potential solution. Do you favor something like that? Do you, from your study of taxation, is a sales tax where you impose, the tax upon the consumption as opposed the income? Is that a better alternative? I guess what I'm asking is as we near the conclusion here, is what type of tax system do you think is the best, having examined so many in the past?
Well, your man there is a great American economic philosopher called Henry George. Mm-hmm. And it was because of his findings that they invented the game Monopoly. The game Monopoly was designed to illustrate the injustice of monopolistic land ownership. Mm-hmm. Anyway, and he had this idea of what he called the single tax. So there is only one tax in the entire country. No income tax, no sales tax, no fuel duties, no alcohol duties, nothing. Just one tax. And it's a voluntary tax. And you pay a tax based on the amount of land that you use. And but this is, you value the land in its undeveloped state. So his idea was that nobody made the land. Nature gave it to us. And if you build a house on it, or you build a farm or a factory or a mine or whatever it is, then you've improved the land. But whatever was there, nature gave to us. And therefore, as nature gave it to us, it should be communally owned by all. Any improvements you make, any improvements that are there as the result of human endeavor, are yours to keep 100%. But if you want exclusive rights to a plot of land, and you want the government to protect your rights to that land, your title, then you should pay a small fee to the community for the exclusive rights to that land. And the beauty of this tax is it's a tax that's directly and immediately felt. So if a government starts demanding too much money because its spending increases, the taxpayer will very quickly go, no, you're spending too much money, and hold them to account. Mm-hmm. It also avoids this thing of people voting for the government to spend money who don't contribute anything. Because it's only people who pay a fee to the government who are allowed to vote. Mm-hmm. So it's a beautiful system that quite organically keeps government and taxpayer in check. And this book, Progress and Poverty, I think it was called, was a huge bestseller at the end of the 19th century. The problem with it is it's not got a fat chance in hell of ever happening, as Henry George described it. There's too much vested interest going against it. But it's a very nice thought experiment to consider. So that is what I argue for, even though I fully recognize that what we will probably see is some bastardized version of it in addition to other taxes rather than to replace other taxes. And that I do not favor at all. You asked about sales tax. And I suppose one positive to sales taxes is that in a way, they're a voluntary tax, because if you don't want to pay taxes, you just buy less stuff. If you don't want to pay the government, you don't buy that thing. But I don't think that's a good economic incentive. Another argument that you could make against sales taxes is that they're not, it's a regressive tax. So if we all buy, I've got a phone here, so say this phone's $1,000, everyone pays the same whatever it is, $150, $200 tax on the phone. If you're the richest person in the world or the poorest person in the world, you pay the same amount of tax. And there are some people argue that the rich should pay more tax than the poor. So in that sense, it's not equitable. That's another argument against it. But if the government was attempting to fund all its expenditure through sales taxes alone, then goodness knows how expensive everyday items would become. They would be so expensive that people just wouldn't hardly buy stuff at all. And that's not good for the economy. You know, if you're making stuff and selling stuff and you need people to buy that stuff. And so all in all, I get the argument about sales taxes, but I'm not entirely convinced about the practicality of it.
You've been listening to the voice of Dominic Frisby. He is the author of a very fascinating book entitled Daylight Robbery. And I'm looking here at the table of contents. There's just so many different topics that are covered in this book. He talks about the Black Death and how it changed the tax structure of Europe. He talks about how taxes gave us the modern nation states that we have today. He talks about the real reason for the U.S. Civil War being rooted in taxation and the birth of big government in the wake of all of that. He even gets into cryptocurrency and talks about how it may be impacting the current tax structure and how that could all evolve over time. And I strongly encourage you to check out the book. As I mentioned, you can pick it up anywhere. It's entitled Daylight Robbery. And our guest today... Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
I love that book, and everyone should read it, and everyone should have it in their library, and everyone should listen to the audiobook. The audiobook was very popular, by the way. But I have a Substack letter that I write, and the Substack letter is very popular. And so if I were able to send your listeners in the way of that Substack letter, you know, the more subscribers we have, there's loads of free options, the better. And it's basically theflyingfrisbee.com, theflyingfrisbee.com, but you spell frisbee F-R-I-S-B-Y, theflyingfrisbee.com.
Theflyingfrisbee.com. We'll also encourage people to check that out as well. So it's been a fascinating discussion today with you, Dominic. I would imagine we could continue. I get the sense we could go on for hours on this topic, and there's so much here. So for those who are interested in learning more, be sure to pick up the book or also check out theflyingfrisbee.com with a Y. Any final words before we conclude?
No, it's been really fun talking to you, and I hope your listeners like it. And if they liked the podcast, share it with a friend.
Thank you so much for being here. I look forward to talking to you again sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, friends, welcome back to the broadcast. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Dominic Frisby. Again, his book is entitled Daylight Robbery. Feel free to check it out. Also, check out his Substack. Very interesting perspective there, certainly from someone across the pond that provides a little bit of different kind of perspective, which I think is interesting. But for those who are interested in the history of economics or taxation, I think the book is really helpful. So anyway, today, of course, taxation, the topic, remains very hotly debated issue. Some people believe that taxes are too high and that the government spending is out of control. Others believe that taxes are necessary to fund essential services and to promote social justice. And people have opinions all across the board. What you can count on is the fact that taxation is not going away anytime soon, right? It's going to be a source of controversy. It's going to be a source of debate. People will be calling for higher taxes, lower taxes to address societal challenges. Before we close out today's show, some of you are probably pretty alarmed at what's been happening in the economy, what's been happening in the financial markets, particularly the financial sector here in the United States, the banking sector. I just released a new members-only video entitled Financial Sector Warning, where I drill down really deep into what's happening, but also provide a lot of context for what's going on. And as you know, as the author of a book called Bankruptcy of Our Nation, I am concerned about the future of our economy, and we do have solutions that we teach our members. And if you are not currently a member, I encourage you to go to followthemoney.com and check out our plans and pricing page. Become a member, unlock instant access to that brand new video. You can start a 7-day free trial as a member and unlock that video and get a lot of good information about what's going on right now in the financial sector here in the United States. It's a lot of alarm that people should be concerned about. We have many, many problems that are unaddressed here in the United States, and protecting yourself and protecting your family, that's really the most important thing that you can do as a citizen. Before you try to fix the White House, it might be better to get your own financial house in order. That's our philosophy. So with all that said, it's time to bring this episode to a close. I sure enjoy the fact that you were able to be here today, and I really appreciate being able to speak into your life each time we do these podcasts. And as always, I'd like to leave you with a final word. This time, just a quip from Will Rogers, who said, "Be thankful we're not getting all the government that we're paying for." And that's just something to think about. Remember, friends, when you want the truth about the global economy, just follow the money. Have a safe and prosperous week, and we'll see you right back here next time. Until then, God bless.
Information contained on the Follow the Money podcast is strictly for informational and educational purposes. It should not be construed as specific investment advice. The views and opinions of our guests and sponsors, including Tom Cloud, are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of FTMDaily.com or Robinson Media Group, LLC. Jerry Robinson does hold an insurance license and at times may offer consulting on life insurance and fixed retirement income products. Follow-up, individualized responses to email or phone requests that involve the rendering of personalized investment advice for compensation will not be made absent compliance with state investment advisor registration requirements or an applicable exemption or exclusion and applicable insurance regulations. Past performance is not indicative of future results. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on the podcast. Remember, never do your financial planning through podcast or radio. It's your money. Be wise.